Let's see if this works. Okay, I am live now, I believe, with Under Construction. Um, welcome to the fifth episode of Under Construction, Puzzles with me, Nathan Curtis. This week, we are talking about, just one moment, let me switch to the right window. Oops. We are talking about Statue Battle. Now, Statue Battle is a logic puzzle hybrid type that I created myself, or I combined the two parts myself anyway. And the first Statue Battle puzzle that I published was in June 2015 on my Patreon, patreon.com/Nathan Curtis. It was in the first month or so of me starting out as a puzzle creator on Patreon. I think I had first worked on writing that puzzle during the spring while I was still making plans to launch the Patreon, but this is when it was first published. Now, it's not an entirely original creation, and even the combination itself has some precedence. So it's a combination of the two common logic puzzle types, Statue Park and Star Battle. And there were previously, to my Statue Battle, there were Star Battle puzzles that had pentomino motifs, which is to say they used pentomino regions the way that the Statue Battle does, but they were presented as pure star battles. An example is linked here from January 2015 of a Star Battle by Carl Worth, which basically is the entire same idea that I had, only presented as a Star Battle. Where the hybrid part comes in is that you use Statue Park logic to determine the regions which make up an ordinary Star Battle puzzle, and I'll go into more about that later. But in order to talk about how the Statue Battle works, we first have to talk about the component parts. So first we'll talk about Star Battle. It's an object placement puzzle type. You could also say it's binary determination because you're determining whether each square in a grid does or does not have a star. I don't consider that, that's just sort of splitting hairs at that point. Invented by Hans Indebach. I apologize if I mispronounced the Dutch surname there. But it was for the World Puzzle Championships in 2003, which were held in the Netherlands. And it is presented as a square grid, which is divided into smaller regions. And you're given a number which indicates how many stars will go into each region. And the goal for the solver is to place stars in individual squares in the grids according to some rules. Each row, column, and outlined region will contain that number of stars. And no two stars can be adjacent to one another, and that includes diagonally adjacent. So here is an example that I cooked up of a 5x5 star battle with one star in each region. You can see that the size of the regions ranges from 4 squares to 2 4-square regions to 5 square regions and 1 7-square region. And I'm not going to go through the process of solving this, but when it is solved, the solution looks a bit like the figure on the right, where you have several, the 5 stars, 1 in each row, 1 in each column, and 1 in each region, and none of them are adjacent. If we then go over to Statue Park, which is the other half of the puzzle, this is sort of a shape placement puzzle that was invented by Palmer Mebane in 2011. And the puzzle is also presented as a grid, but in this case, rather than regions that are outlined, you have a few black and white circles in individual squares, and a prescribed set of shapes, which is often the 12 pentominoes. Sometimes it might be something else. It might be a subset of the pentominoes. It might be two copies of the set of pentominoes. It might be a set of tetrominoes. It might be shapes that just are pretty shapes. It's pretty open-ended there. And you must place those shapes in the grid, and you can rotate and reflect the pieces before they go into the grid, so that no two shapes share an edge, although they can touch on a corner, and the empty squares in the grid are all contiguous. And in a statue park, the black circles represent squares that are occupied by a shape, and the white circles represent empty squares. I don't have an example of a statue park puzzle to show you right now because I was running low on time, so I couldn't make one myself. But hopefully that gives you an idea of what the two parts are, so that we can move on to the combination, the statue battle. So the puzzle will be presented as a square grid with black and white circles in some individual squares, and a set of shapes, which is usually the pentominoes, and a number that indicates the count of stars in each row, column, or region. And you place the shapes into the grid according to statue park rules. That is, the shapes must not touch on any edges, the empty space must be contiguous, and you must have a shape covering every black circle and no shape in a square with a white circle. And you place stars into the shapes according to star battle rules. And the thing that I strive for when making these is that there should be more than one solution to the statue park if you solved it in isolation. Because you might think, oh, I'll solve the statue park and I'll get the locations of all the shapes, and then I will use them as regions for a star battle. My intention in creating the first puzzle was to have it so that you had to work back and forth between the two puzzle types, that as you placed a shape, you had to think about what that meant for the star battle and how that restricted where other shapes could be placed. So you have to consider both the shapes and the stars as you go. As I said, using constraints from star battle logic to limit the possible placements in the statue park. And actually, before I go on to parameters and conventions, I realized that I forgot to throw in an example of the statue battle. So I will do that first. Just go and find the let's see if I can remember where I put the puzzle that I wanted to show you. Puzzle, going through my currently going through my file system to find it. It would have been about June 2015. Let's see. June 19th, June 23. All right. Found the statue battle. All right, this one. So the rules are given. Place the 12 given shapes in the grid so that no two shapes overlap, and so forth. It's basically what I've already said, that you have to place shapes in according to statue park rules, and place stars in according to star battle rules. And in the puzzle, I have the 12 by 12 grid above. Below, I have the 12 pentominoes, which represent the shapes that must be placed in the grid. I shrank them down just to make it fit more easily on a single page. And in this case, I decided to give the clues, the black and white circles, in sort of three in a row chunks, like tic-tac-toe. And if we then go to what would be July 2015, I should have the solution to that one. Yes. So in this case, the solution I just gave as a single grid. You don't need to give the shapes anymore because the shapes are already put in the grid. But if you were to look at this, you'd see, okay, all 12 pentominoes are in the grid, and there are stars, 2 stars in each pentomino, 2 stars in each row, 2 stars in each column. None of the stars are adjacent. So this is the valid solution. Working out that this is the unique valid solution is another matter entirely, but we'll get into that as we talk about constructing these. So if we then go back to, if we then go back to the intro and scroll back to where I was in the intro, apologies. Oh, right. So having said all that, and some of this was covered in the examples that you saw, but I want to talk about what parameters and conventions apply to star battles as I have conceived them, and how you might modify them if you want to do your own variations. So the first major parameter for the grid is going to be a square grid with exactly as many rows and columns as there are shapes. This is a logical requirement, just based on the fact that every shape has the same number of stars, every row has the same number of stars, and every column has the same number of stars. If you count up all the stars, that's going to be the number of stars per region multiplied by the number of regions or rows or columns. So each of those numbers of rows, columns, and shapes must be equal. So it must be a square grid, and the size of the square grid is exactly the same as the number of shapes you are putting into it. There is an option to have the grid one row and column larger, using the empty space as a region to place stars in. This is the statue battle with pentominoes that I linked to previously. Well, you probably can't click on the link because it's in the video, but it was the Star Battle by Carl Worth from January of 2015. That was a 13 by 13 grid with the 12 pentominoes and a large, I think he said it was 109 square region for each of which had 2 stars. This is an option I decided when creating this type that it seemed more consistent in my head that the stars would only go in the pentomino shapes. And since this is a statue park type puzzle, or incorporates statue park aspects, you need to have a set of shapes that you are going to use. I've used 12 pentominoes in the past, and that fits nicely in a 12 by 12 statue park grid. 12 by 12 is a common size for a 12 pentomino statue park grid, even when it doesn't have other constraints. If you go to a place like Grandmaster Puzzles, you'll see examples of that. And 12 by 12 would be the required size if you have 12 pentominoes. And one other nice thing about using all the pentominoes is that each pentomino is capable of holding 2 stars without them being adjacent. This is not the case of all of the tetrominoes, because the 2 by 2 square can only contain 1 star. Otherwise, they would either be adjacent by an edge or diagonally. And if you wanted to have a complete set of regions that all could hold 3 stars, you would have to go up to heptaminoes, and there happen to be 108 heptaminoes, which is really quite a lot to fit in a single grid. You would have a 108 by 108 square grid, obviously. And so you don't gain the ability to add in more stars by going to hexaminoes. So if you're going to go up to hexaminoes or to variable sized regions, you probably want to do it for some kind of aesthetic reason, like making pictures out of the shapes. You could do some variants that use the set of tetrominoes. And so if you use all of the tetrominoes, it would have to be a one-star puzzle. And all tetrominoes could be one-sided, which is where you can rotate any of the shapes, but you can't reflect them, which means that instead of just having an S tetromino, you have both an S and a Z. Similar for the L, you have an L and a J, say. Or if you want to make sure that it's a two-star puzzle, if you just do the L, I, T, and S tetrominoes, which is already a common version in many other tetromino-based puzzles, such as Lits, you could do 2 stars then in each region. And in that case, you have 4 shapes. I might recommend something like either 2 copies of each of the Lits shapes in an 8x8 grid, or the 6 one-sided Lits shapes, L and J, S and Z, and then I and T don't have any reflected. They don't create new shapes when reflected. Those 6 shapes could be put into a single 6x6 grid. So those are some variants that you could use with tetrominoes. And of course, beyond that, you can make up your own set of shapes. It doesn't have to be all of the pentominoes. Some statue parks will use maybe 9 or 10 of the pentominoes with a smaller grid if they want to do something that uses certain properties that not all of the pentominoes have. And remember that if the shapes that you are using are a fixed size or have a narrow range, maybe you're using anything from tetrominoes to hexominoes, so on the average they're about pentomino sized. The shape coverage is linear, but the grid area is quadratic. What that means is if you have, say, 20 different shapes that are all roughly 5 squares each, roughly pentominoes, then those 20 shapes will cover about 100 squares in your grid, 5 times 20, but the grid will be 20 squared, or 400. So you have 1/4 of the grid covered by shapes. If you go back to the 12x12 region, 12 pentominoes in a 12x12 grid, there are 60 squares that will be covered by the pentominoes out of 144, which is 5 out of 12, which is much more than a fourth. And what this means, since Statue Park often relies on some of the logic in solving a statue park relies on there being only just barely enough room for all of the pentominoes to exist together without being adjacent. A larger grid with 20 pentominoes in a 20x20 grid will have the problem of not having basically there being too much space then for these pentominoes to be in, which means you could still write the puzzle, but you would probably need a lot more initial clues to solve it, and it would probably get less interesting and more tedious. There are also some parameters and conventions that apply to the stars, not necessarily how you draw the stars or anything, but specifically about the number of stars. The number of stars in a row, column, or region must be at most 1/4 of the number of rows. Basically, if you have more than that, it is impossible to fit them all into the grid just according to the row and column constraints. You will have to have stars that are adjacent. And one way to visualize this is to think that if you divide your whole grid up into 2x2 squares, each of those 2x2 subgrids can only contain at most 1 star. If you put two stars in a single 2x2 subgrid, those will be adjacent to each other no matter how you do it. And so that means that basically there's going to be a fourth as many subgrids in your larger grid as there are squares in the larger grid. And if you do the counting argument again, you find out, oh, yeah, at most 1/4 of the spaces in here can be filled with stars, which means that the number of stars in a particular row, column, or region can be at most 1/4 of the side length. Furthermore, if those numbers, the number of stars, if that is equal to 1/4 of the number of rows, then it is going to be so constrained that there are only going to be maybe, counting reflections and rotations, usually one or two, I forget whether it's always one or two, legal star placements, even if you don't think about the regions. And so that means that if you then try to make regions that fit with them, and you have a set of prescribed shapes, as with the pentominoes, you may not even be able to place them properly in the first place. So for one star, in any star battle related puzzle, I would say you want a 5x5 grid or larger. For 2 stars, 10x10 grid or larger. For 3 stars, 15x15 grid or larger. You'll notice that this is about 5 squares on a side for each star. And I have not yet written a statue battle type puzzle that used 3 stars per region. That would require large regions on average, and with this size grid, it's more, it's probably trickier than I want to do right at this point. And this is also where the problem of shape coverage versus grid size becomes difficult, because now, you know, as I said, with the 12x12 grid filled with 12 pentominoes, you have 5 out of 12, which is a little over 40% of the grid is filled. If you start getting down below, say, 1/3 of the grid, then you don't have as many constraints based on fitting things into the grid, and so you need more clues to make it uniquely solvable. So now we can think about how we're going to construct this, and I'm only going to do half of the puzzle today. That is to say, I'm only going to create the solution grid. The clues I will save for another stream in a couple weeks, just to make sure that this doesn't go too terribly long. So the solution grid, in this case, is going to be a valid statue park arrangement that has a unique star battle solution. If we were to go back to the puzzle that the solution of the star battle that I wrote back in 2015, if I were to give you this full grid without the stars, but just the shaded shapes, you would see, okay, this is definitely a valid statue park solution. There are 12 pentominoes, they don't touch on a side, and the white squares are all contiguous. And then if you were to then take those 12 regions and try to put stars in them, you would find that this arrangement is the only possible arrangement of stars. And this means, and this is important, this is a requirement for this particular puzzle variant, that the statue park solution, whatever you pick, has to have a unique statue battle solution associated with it, because since you're giving people clues in the manner of a statue park, the most information you can possibly give them is the solved statue park grid without the stars. Anything else that you would actually give them is going to be strictly less information, and so therefore, if the full statue park solution grid is not solvable as a star battle, then you won't be able to create a uniquely solvable puzzle no matter how hard you try. And so in order to attack that, first we want to consider what are the star placement options for each pentomino shape. I haven't explicitly said this in this guide here, but I am operating under the assumption that we are making a 12 by 12 grid with the 12 pentominoes and 2 stars in each of the pentominoes. So we want to consider the star placement options for each pentomino shape. And so I made some illustrations that show the possible arrangements of stars in each of the shapes. So in each of these cases, I'm assuming that we have already put a pentomino in place on the board, on the grid. And trying to answer the question, how many different ways can I place 2 stars in a single pentomino without violating the adjacency constraints? And so this will go on for 3 pages. On this first page, first we have the F on the left, and we see that there are 3 possible ways to put 2 stars into the F pentomino. And you can sort of work your way, you can work through these by saying, well, what if we put a star in the upper left square of this pentomino? What if there isn't a star and we put one in the next one, and so forth, and until you exhaust all of those possibilities. And then asking what are the possible valid places that the second star can go. If we then go to the I pentomino, we see that there are 6 possibilities. This is the largest number of possibilities for any of the pentomino types. An L has 5 possibilities. You see that having a single bend in the shape basically causes a reduction by 1 in the number of possible solutions, but it gets more complicated as the shapes themselves get more complicated. And we see that some of the solutions for the L have both of the stars in the long portion of the L, and then some of the solutions have a star in the part of the L that protrudes. Then the N, there are 4 solutions. The P, there are only 2 solutions. You know that one of the stars has to go in the panhandle of the P, or the tail of the P, if you prefer to think of it as an actual letter and not the state of Utah. And then the other star only has 2 possible places that it can go, because two of the remaining locations are adjacent to that panhandle. Then we go to the rest of the alphabet. T, there are again 4 possible arrangements, and we see that 3 of those arrangements have one of the stars at the very bottom of the T, and the 4th arrangement has the 2 stars in the opposite ends of the crossbar of the T. The U has 4 solutions. In each case, you can't have one in the crossbar of the U, but you have 1 star on the left side, 1 star on the right side, and each of those has 2 possible places, which gives you a total of 4. The V has 5 possibilities. If you think about it, especially for some of these with like the V and the L, you can think of those as taking the I pentomino and folding it. And so if you were to unfold any of the valid arrangements for a V, say, you would still have a valid solution for the I. But when you fold it, that means that there's 1 solution for the I, in this case having stars in the 2nd and 4th positions of the I. If you were to fold it at the 3rd square to create a V, then those 2, the 2nd and 4th squares, would then be diagonally adjacent, so they could not both contain stars. And that's also, you can also think of the 5 arrangements for the L in that way as well. The W has 3 solutions, and here's another case where you can eliminate some possibilities. You can't have a star in the middle of the W, and so you have one of the stars being on in this case, the vertical bar of the W on the left, and one of the stars being in the horizontal bar of the W on the bottom. Two choices for each of those, but one of those is impossible, where the two of them are both closest to the center of the W, then they are again adjacent. An X has only two solutions, either the two vertical extremes of the X or the two horizontal extremes of the X. And then Y and Z each have four possibilities. You can see the Y has some possibilities that use only the straight part of the Y, and one possibility that uses the protruding part of the Y. And a Z has four options. And looking at those, when I first started working on this, I drew these configurations out on graph paper and just sort of looked at them and tried to deduce patterns from them that I could use to help me construct the statue battle. In considering the star placement options, some of these shapes have sort of automatically come with certain constraints that will be useful. The I shape and the X shape, no matter how you place them, both of the stars will be in a single row or column. For the I, this is obviously true because the I is entirely contained in a single row or column. But for the X, since you either have the two vertical extremities or the two horizontal extremities, and both of those are in a single row or column, then again, they're both in a row or column, but in this case, you don't know when you've placed the X whether they'll both be in a row or both be in a column. The P, U, and Z shapes, you find out that you must have one star in each of two rows or columns, and I forget whether I got this down in the written instructions here, but in the P shape, we also said that the panhandle must contain a star no matter what, and that is the only one of the pentominoes where when you have two stars in them, you know without any other information that there is a star in this particular location. Everything else, there are enough possibilities that some of them have a star in that location and some of them don't. If a single pentomino fits in a 3x3 subgrid, the center square of that grid cannot have a star, because if that one had a star, there's nowhere to put the second star without being adjacent to the center square. This also, for the P and U shapes, both of those fit in a 2x3 rectangle, so they fit into two different 3x3 subgrids, which means that there are two squares that are potentially off limits, although in the case of the U, it's really only one. And that contributes to why they have some more constraints than other shapes do. And when we're actually going to do the construction, start by placing some of the constrained shapes like I or X, but don't put any stars in yet. And add white space around them as required by the statue park rules. And then work on how you can put other shapes nearby to work with those star constraints. And that not only means being consistent with the constraints of those stars, but where the constraints of those shapes themselves interact in useful ways with the constraints of those shapes you've already placed. So, for example, any shape that is partly occupying a row that is already completely filled with stars. For example, if you have your I placed horizontally in the top row, anything else in that top row that is nothing there can contain a star unless it's in the eye. So if you put another pentomino in that row, the stars in that pentomino can't go in the first row. And shapes that are diagonally adjacent to possible star locations. Remember that in a statue park, two shapes cannot touch by an edge, which means that some of the adjacency constraints of a star battle don't really help, but you still have the diagonal adjacencies because two shapes can touch diagonally. And if you know that there are two possibilities for placing a shape somewhere, and you know, and one of them would lead to two diagonally adjacent shapes having stars at that diagonal adjacency, then that one can be ruled out and you get it down to one possibility. And then lather, rinse, repeat. Basically, you're going to pick, anytime you put something down, consider what that means in terms of possible star placements, what that means in terms of the statue park, because you need to make sure that the white squares have enough room that they can stay connected. No part of the empty squares in the grid is cut off from some other part. Can a new shape be rotated or replaced with the same star arrangement? This, you don't always have to think about this at the time, but it is useful for a couple of reasons. One is when you are getting to the part of the puzzle where you are putting in the statue park clues. You want to make sure that anytime a shape could be rotated or replaced, and without changing the arrangement of stars, that you supply enough explicit clues to make sure that one of them is eliminated, or to make sure that there's only one possibility of those that can go there. In some cases, you don't need to worry. An X, well, no matter how you rotate or reflect it, it's always going to be an X. But if you then say, oh, I could also replace this X with an F, and that F itself could be rotated or reflected, that adds some ambiguities that you need to make sure you address when you are putting clues in later. The other aspect is that later, when you're trying to finish the puzzle, you sometimes want to see if you can replace one shape with another and still have similar star arrangements and logic that restricts the star arrangements, because the shape that you need to place can't go in the available space, but this other similar shape that you put somewhere else could be swapped with it and fit in that space. We'll probably run into this at some point when constructing the grid. Keep track of the shapes that you've used, and keep track of the number of stars in each row, column, and shape. Once you have found that you have the full number of stars in a particular row or column, you can just sort of check off and know that none of the other squares in that row or column can have a star. Similarly for the shapes. Now, at some point, usually after placing around 8 of the 12 pentominoes, I start looking at the available space left and go, oh, these aren't all going to fit in here, without causing some kind of contradiction. So you need to be on the watch out for figuring out when you've gotten to a point where you just can't place the remaining shapes no matter what you do. So, and things that may lead to an unsolvable configuration, if you have a row or column that cannot possibly get 2 stars in it. If you've already placed some shapes in and around a particular row, but you already know that those that the squares in shapes in that row, none of them can contain a star, and you find out that the number of available places to put stars in that row just can't be satisfied with the remaining with the remaining shapes, then that's an impossibility. Also look for times when you have a shape that you cannot put in the remaining space within the statue park rules. And some shapes are more difficult to place than others for various reasons. Some shapes are easy to place if they're near the side of a grid. Some pieces are easier to place if they're in the middle of a grid. And at some point when you get near the end, you'll have some things that just don't want to go where they need to. And when you run into those unsolvable configurations, the only thing you can do is to backtrack. That is, go back and figure out what are the last placements that I settled on and undo those, or possibly go back even further and say, okay, I can switch the X with an F and see if that helps me. The one problem with the thing you have to be careful about if you are switching a placement that is not just a simple backtrack, one that was not your last decision made, is to make sure that switching that placement doesn't change the logical constraints. If the stars that you had placed in the X still fit in the F, that's still a valid solution, but it doesn't mean that the solution to that point is still unique. And that's something that you have to be careful of if you are switching things further back in your decision tree. So that's it for the constructing strategy. So now we'll go and actually construct. All right, so I have here a grid, and I'm actually going to do so I've added some conditional formatting to this grid. On the left, at the bottom, there is a square grid, 12 by 12, which will contain the pentominoes and the stars. And what I have done is I've added conditional formatting so that I'm going to enter the letter, in each square I will enter the letter corresponding to that pentomino. So I might decide that if I'm going to put the I pentomino vertically in the top, I might go I, 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 I. And the way the conditional formatting works, each of the squares in the grid is shaded according to the letter of the pentomino. And above the grid, I have columns keeping track of how many spaces are occupied by that particular shape. If that number is more than 0 but less than 5, I will highlight it in yellow. But this is case insensitive, by the way. When it gets to 5, it'll highlight that letter in green to let me know that, okay, don't put any more I's anywhere in this grid. And if I go over, for some reason, it will highlight it in red, and I'll know that I'm really goofed up with that shape. It is still my responsibility to make sure that the 5 squares that make up the letter I are in fact in an I shape. There's not a good way to get a spreadsheet to recognize that for you. If you were writing your own program from scratch, you could, but here that's not going to be feasible. That's fine. I'll just have to, check when you're doing this that each of the shapes that you're making is in fact the shape you say it is. I'm also, if a shape has a star in it, I will put an exclamation mark in that square. So if I'm going back here and I say I, and I decide that for some reason the logic dictates that the upper left square have a star in it, I'm going to put an exclamation point in that square as well. And now the conditional formatting first turns that particular square a different color. It's a sort of peach color. What I wanted to do was change the text color, but leave the leave the shading color the same as what was already in the square, but I don't see a way for the conditional formatting to change, to leave, to not make a decision in the shading. I also, now that I think of it, want to have a way to mark squares that must be empty. But before I get to the empty squares, I'll talk a little bit more about what the exclamation marks do. So the exclamation mark is also going to, on the outside of the grid, we have this little count of how many stars, represented by the exclamation marks, are in each row and column. You might say, well, why didn't you use asterisks instead of exclamation marks? And that's because in the Google Sheets text, basically the text functions treat asterisk as a wild card in many cases, and it's very hard to get it to realize that you want a literal asterisk and not just match everything. So I decided exclamation mark was good for a star. And you see that we have 1 star in the first column, 1 star in the first row. If we then go and put, say, a T somewhere else, and we've determined that there is also an exclamation mark there, we now have 1 star in each of 2 columns, 2 stars in the first row. That row is now marked in green to say that we have as many stars as we need. If we put a 3rd star in, it will get marked in red. The other thing that I have is this big grid of 1s and 0s, well, currently 1s and 0s. Basically, what this is doing is for each possible 2x2 group of squares, how many stars are in that group? If it's a valid star battle solution, there will be either 0 or 1 stars in any 2x2 subgrid. If you have 2 stars in that 2x2 subgrid, those 2 stars must be adjacent. And if there are 2 adjacent stars somewhere in the grid, there will be a 2x2 subgrid that has 2 stars in it. And so, as long as each of the numbers in this grid on the right is 1 or 0, that is that there is either 0 or 1 stars in any 2x2 subgrid, then all of the stars that we've placed are all separated from each other, and that's fine. If we have 2 that are adjacent, we want to flag that. So if I then put in, obviously it's not going to, we can't actually put a legitimate space there, but if I put another exclamation mark there, even though there's 1 star in the first row and column, 1 star in the second row and column, we now have 2 stars in the upper left-hand corner of the grid, and we see that that one violates the conditions. Oh, I wanted to add conditional formatting up here as well, because this number here below the ADJ is telling me how many places do I have to adjacent stars. So where is the formatting that I want to add to that? Conditional formatting. So if it is greater than 0, and we want to make that red as well. Okay. So I added conditional formatting there, and so I have some different colored flags that will tell me whether I have satisfied the constraints that I need. And my goal is to get things so that each of the numbers indicating how many squares of a particular letter I've put in the grid is at 5 and highlighted in green. That there are 2 stars or in each row and column, and they'll be highlighted by highlighted in green as well, and that there's nothing that this number of adjacent stars is always 0. That's my goal. So that's just the setup to make sure that as much of the checking of the logic is taken care of by the computer, by the spreadsheet. But it's still up to me to actually go and fill this. Now, as I said, some of the different shapes that are good to consider for constraints are the I, the X, the P, and so I want to think about using those in various ways. I'm going to start with often it's easy to put the I on the outer edge, but I'm going to actually start with a P maybe, just to make things different. Let's put it pretty much in the middle here. The placement might come back to haunt me, but I'll put 5 P's in here. I'm not putting any stars in yet. I also mentioned that I wanted to keep track of empty space, but I'm now realizing that adding the conditional formatting to handle empty space is going to be difficult, and I also can't easily determine if the empty space is connected. So I will just leave the formatting as it is. You'll just have to imagine that I'm marking squares that have to be empty. But when I say empty, I mean empty of any of the shapes. And therefore, if they don't have a shape in them, they can't have a star either. I am not doing anything in particular to mark any squares that must be in a shape but cannot be in a star. So we know that the P pentomino must have one of the stars must be in the panhandle. So I'm just right away going to put a P there. And I had just got it in my mind that I wanted to do something with the interaction between the P and the X. And I will show you what I mean in just a second. I'm going to see what happens if we put the P and the X here. Actually, I will use E for empty squares if I know they have to be empty, but I'm not going to do any conditional formatting on them. They will just have an E in them and the background will be white. I will try to use lowercase e's so it doesn't get confused with the letters that have shapes in them, but as long as it's a white square, it does not have a shape, and if there's something in there, then it cannot have a shape. So if we look at how the P and the X interact here, we see that the leftmost square in the X cannot have an exclamation mark. If we put an exclamation mark there, we have 2 adjacent stars. So that doesn't work. And we know that there are only 2 possible configurations for the stars in an X shape, that it's either the left and right extremes or the top and bottom. The left one didn't work, so we must have the top and bottom. And we've gotten ourselves now, without doing much work, we found that now we have 1 row and 1 column, which each have 2 stars in them already. They're already full up, and hopefully we can use that to our advantage later on. If we look at the P, go back to the P now, we know that the remaining star must be somewhere on the left of the P, because it can't be in the center, in the second column, but it can't be in the bottom row of the P because that's already has 2 stars in it. So we have some more deductions there. I'm going to add an empty space, and the way that I am making deductions about empty space is that anything which is immediately adjacent to a single pentomino that is already placed must be empty, and anything that would otherwise block an empty square or a group of empty squares off from the rest of the grid must be empty as well. If we had put in, say, an L in the square adjacent to the E that is between the P and the X, then that E would be isolated from the rest of the grid. And so now what I want to do is use some of these well, two things. I want to use some of these constraints to figure out, use the fact that we've already placed um, two stars in a couple of rows and columns, and also look at now that we've placed two shapes near the middle of the grid, that we have some open space above and below them that should be filled because there's not a lot of free space to maneuver in a statue park. And also we need to get the right number of shapes covered in those areas. Sorry, the right number of stars in those areas. You'll see that if we look at just the first three rows, we're going to have four more stars in those first three rows. And although there's a couple of ways you can slide partial shapes into there, you're probably going to have to, most of the arrangements will have maybe two whole shapes in that area, but you also have to be careful that you have that you can place stars in the fourth row as well. So the other strongly constrained shapes, and it can be, again, good to think about those as we go along, those were the I and the U and the Z. I kind of want to keep at least one of those in reserve because they're all somewhat easy to fit into tight spaces, which will be useful as we go along. But one thing that might be useful for as we go along in here is realizing that if we have one star already placed in the leftmost column, that any shape that is against this column can only have at most one star in that leftmost column. The other star, its second star, must be in a different column. And this can allow us to do some deductions. For example, if I said I want to put an L right here, we know that we can't have both of the L's stars in the leftmost column, which means one of the stars must be here in the second column. So I'll go with that placement. It might be that we need to go back and fix it at some point. We know that the other star in the L must be one of the top two squares, but we don't know which at this point. And that is going to fill up all of the left-hand column. So we can't put any more stars in that part of the grid. So let me see. We now have placed an L, a P, an X. So if we think about where to go next, I don't want to do something that is too that takes up too much empty space, because I might already be running into issues where somewhere down the line there isn't enough space to fit all of the shapes. I'd rather have too much space for the shapes than and then figure out how to narrow that down to a single solution than have not enough space and have no solutions. We also have some places, for example, I'm losing count here, but I think it's like the eighth row here, where 5 of the spaces have been marked as empty, and we have no stars yet. And in fact, there's another space that can't have a star because it's adjacent to a star. So we have 6 spaces that must have 2 stars. That's a little tight. I am going to just take a look around at the different options here. Oh no, can't have that. And again, once we place a star in the second star in the L, we still have to have 4 more stars that get placed into the first 3 rows, and so we must have at least two shapes that take up space in that area. And I think I might play around a little bit more with areas where we know that, for example, here, that we've placed some stars in the X. We know that placing a shape that is diagonally adjacent will constrain the possible places that a star could go there in that shape. So maybe we put an F here, and that F, we know it has to grow out like that, and but we know that we can't block off the E's that are growing over there. So now if we had an F, it would have to go here. The F that is diagonally adjacent to the top of the X can't have a star, and the only combination of stars that fills an F without that one. Oh, now I see that I've run myself into a problem by picking an F, because we had to put a star in the 5th column, which makes 3 stars in that particular column. So an F was not the right shape to put there. So I'm continuing to think some about the different shape options available. Now I'm going to try a W. This is a little bit tough because it now cuts off a lot of space that can't have any shapes in the upper left, but that might still be fine. But we can look at the W now. We know that there's no star adjacent to the star on the X, and once we've removed that as a possibility, the other stars must come there and there. All right. We still haven't had any other fully completed rows or columns yet, although we know that there will be a star, second star in the left-hand column. I'm going to try something like a Z or an F. I'm currently using a Z, but an F will have similar logic. We know that the left part of the Z can't be filled with a star, because that would make 3 stars in the left-hand column. Then the only place, in order to fit 2 Z's then, if we can't have one in the upper left-hand corner of the Z, the other one must be in the top center. that gives us 2 stars in the second column, so the only place a third star can go is there. Put more empty squares around it. We do know that we need to have, here's an interesting case where even though we don't know what shape we have put down, we actually can constrain a star placement. We only have 1 star in the 4th column. And there are now only 2 squares it could go in, but one of those squares is adjacent to a place that already has a star. So whatever goes, there must be a star in the other shape, which then further implies that that is covered by a shape, and a couple of other and some of the other things in this region are now fully determined by having that shape there. And we know that whatever else it has, it can't have any other stars in the 4th or 5th column. The second star must come in the 6th column or further. If it's in the 6th column, it can only be so far, so close. You know, if it's all the way in the 8th column, the only thing we can have, that's in fact an impossibility. We can't have this be an eye, because then we would need to have a second star in the eye that makes a third star in that column. So we know that whatever the second star is in this unknown shape, in fact, I'm going to put a question mark in it just to remind me that it's unknown. For some reason it has to start with a question mark. And we still are in the situation where we need to have two stars in the row above that, and we also have some rows below it that need stars. So we're going to have to figure out how that's going to get covered. So if we look at the available shapes that can go in there, if we were to say that it does have not what I should do here now is add some conditional formatting for things that have a question mark in them, but I will leave that aside for now. Well, so if I look at the shapes that we have F, I, N, T, U, V, Y remaining. I, N, and Y are the long shapes, and we know that I has to go somewhere where it that doesn't yet have any stars. And now that I am thinking about it, I want to try putting an I in the 8th row. There are 7 squares left. The I can fit somewhere in the middle, somewhere in there. We know the middle 3 squares must be covered by an I. And whatever happens there, that particular row will be fully filled. The I could rest against the right bar. It could go all the way to the left and be diagonally adjacent to the X. one thing I like about it being diagonally adjacent to the x is that we know right away that it eliminates a possible placement for the for a star. It might cut off part of the grid in a way that I would rather not. But that might not actually. One thing that I did not mention in possible constraints. Sometimes, especially with a letter like with a shape like an I, you'll reach a point where where the places that shapes can go are constrained in such a way. Imagine, let's not put the I there. Let's in fact put the I one square over for maximum mayhem as an illustration, strictly as an illustration. If we then ask ourselves, all right, how do we fill the squares below? We then go, okay, we have 3 stars in the bottom 4 rows. There must be 5 more stars in those rows. One of the stars is from an incomplete and unknown shape. So that means we have 5 stars remaining. Basically, if you get yourself into a position, currently it works, where if we put 3 more shapes, including finishing this unknown shape, in the bottom rows, and remember we would have empty space around this I, if we were to put 3 more shapes down in the bottom, then that would have exactly the right number of regions. If we have, exactly the right number of stars. Complete the shape that we don't know yet, that will provide a 4th star, and then 2 more whole shapes. It might be that they won't all fit in this amount of space, but we can try. But what, the other thing I was going to say about putting things in this space in general is that if we had placed this I here and then ran into a problem where we had 3 placed stars in the bottom 4 rows, it's hard to explain without actually having the situation arise, but there are times when, because you know you must have 2 stars in each row, a particular region must have an even number of stars, and there's no place, if there are some stars that sort of straddle that cutoff region, shapes that straddle that cutoff region, where there is a star that is one shape has a star that is outside that region and one star that is inside, then you must have a second shape that straddles that boundary as well, in order to make sure that there are in fact an even number of stars in the cutoff region. I don't think I'm explaining that well, but it might come up later. Let's see, I had thought about doing an F before in a different place. I'm going to try it now. One thing that I am realizing about an F, though, is that in the F there are 2 possible orientations for it, and no good way to distinguish between them. That is to say that we could have an F go like this, or we could reflect that F around a 40-degree line and have it like that. And unless we have an actual black or white circle as a clue in one of those 2 squares, we can't just, there's no way to distinguish between those 2 possibilities given the setup that exists now. if we think about other shapes that can go in here, let's see, N is going to be long. We don't have a U yet. Usually I save the U for going against against the boundary of a grid. V, Y. Of the different shapes that can reach this particular unknown starred square, I think I'm going to go with the V. There's only one way to put a V in here. Wherever the V can go in either of the two bottom squares in the right-hand column of that V. And I'm now realizing that I can make another deduction about stars. If we look at the 7th column, we see that there are no stars in it yet, and one of the spaces, the one just next to this here in the 3rd position, cannot have a star in it because it would be adjacent to the star in the W. Of the 3 remaining spaces, 2 of them are adjacent, so only one of them can possibly have a star, which means that this square in the I must have a star. All right, we still need to put 2 more shapes in the left portion of the grid. All right, we need to put, let's see. And again, just sort of trying things out to see how they fit. If I were to do it in this arrangement, we know that we can't have a star in the top square of the Y, which means that one of the stars is in the 2nd row of the Y, the other one is at the bottom of the Y. So the T can only have one square in the crossbar, and the other star must be at the vertex there. And both of those rows will get fully filled in, which means that the last star in the V must go in the 2nd row from the bottom. We still don't know where, which particular columns the remaining stars in the T and Y occupy, but that's fine. We now have to provide space for the white space for that and put some more white space around here. All right, we now have FUN. Well, that sounds like fun. Ha ha ha. And there's enough space in here that I think I won't have a problem fitting everything in, which is comforting. F, U, and N. So one thing that I'm considering is putting the n against the far right wall in such a way that we can constrain both the n and the y for where their stars can go. Alternately, we could do something here with the U, but again, I like placing the U against a wall because otherwise the only way to tell in a statue battle, if you have a U that is, say, in the middle of a grid, and I'll give an example here, the stars in that U can only go on the left and right columns, which means that there's no way with just star battle rules to distinguish a right side up U from an upside down U, which means that we must have a statue part clue in that area to tell the two possibilities apart. So U's are easier to identify if they are if they are placed more centrally, but actually I'm going to go to the F because we knew. So if we put whatever goes here, including possibly the F, we know that that square of the F can't have a star unless we somehow manage to fit a different shape over here, such as the N, and it's certainly possible to do that, as you see here. We could theoretically have something like an F and an N where there is a star here, but there's now nowhere for the F to go that doesn't cut off the E's. And even if we had put a different shape here, I think we would have run into the same issue where there's no way to get two shapes of the remaining shapes into this corner, into this patch. So if we have an F here, we can't fit one of the other shapes into the remaining space, and we know that the one space that we've marked in the F can't have a star, so we have to have at least one more space of the F in that column, and that one must have the star. And now there are two possible ways to place that F, depending on which, it can either go F, 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 or it can sort of do the reflection of that and go F, F, F. This particular arrangement, we see that if there's a star where we knew there had to be a star, we would also have to have a star on the right side of the F, which creates 3 stars in a single row. So we can eliminate that from consideration and do that instead. But we now see that we have a problem of, oh, no, I thought there was going to be a problem, but it's not yet a problem. The problem that I was going to mention is that we now have nowhere to put 2 squares, 2 stars in the upper row with a single shape. But that's fine because we could have a star that is provided by the L. Alright, so now we just have the N and the U, and we know that a U can't, even though we could put a U into both of those squares, it can't actually fit there without cutting off part of the white space. So the U can't go there, but we still need at least one, which means that whatever shape goes in the upper right-hand corner can only have one star in the uppermost row, which means we have a star there. Now there's a couple of ways to do this. You could have a U that goes like this, and that's fine because the U can't be rotated or reflected and still without cutting off the rest of the space. But we do have to think about where the possible locations of stars are, and the problem here is that one of the stars, we can probably run into a situation where we can swap the positions of some of the stars given the configuration of everything else in these rows, in the last two rows. So I don't want to put a U there. An N will have to go something like this. And in this case, we know that we must have a star in the upper row, which now fills out that entire column, and which means that we must have one there. We can't put a star in the bottom of the N because that's a full row. And now we can only have one place that the second star in the F can go. So we still have to place the U and the bottom of the N. Sorry, the U is the only thing that has to be placed. Sorry, I'm sort of mumbling here. But now if we look at possible placements for the U, it's going to cut off, again, it's going to cut off space. So if we backed up from putting the N there, again, we can't put the U in that arrangement. So if we went back to putting the U here and said that we're going to do that, we still have an issue of, we're going to have the issue that there will be at least two stars in the U and the Y that could be that could basically be swapped. For instance, if we had, maybe we have U exclamation point here and Y exclamation point here, that we could instead move the star in the Y to the left and the star in the U to the right, and still have a valid star battle solution. So that's going to plague us in this arrangement. So neither of those works, which means we have to back up and to say, all right, let's undo our placement before that, which means that putting the F in the left part of the empty space was the wrong idea. I didn't want to put the U in that space because we would have the problem of having to disambiguate between two different orientations of the U, which means that we have the N in here. If we do something like this, we know that the top square in the N can't be occupied, but we still need to fill out the column, so we must have a star there, which means that the other star goes here, and so far we're still consistent. We still need to put in an F and a U. And I think we're, yeah, as I'm looking at this, it's gonna, yeah, it's gonna, in one way or another, we'll run into the problem of having some, it's sort of like the parity thing that I was trying to explain before, of not being able to put things in certain places. Now we know that there's still going to be one more star in the T, and we still have two columns over here that only have one star in each of them. And we can only fit one star in this 2x2 square up at the top. So there must be one star down in the bottom on the left of the T, which means that the rightmost part of the T does not have a star yet. The F and the U, there is no way to put either the F or the U in the leftmost column, blank column, that would not cut off part of the grid. So whether it's an F or a U, it has to go in the next row, which means that I'm going to put something there. And actually, it doesn't even have to be there now that I think of it, because I was forgetting that we haven't placed all of the stars in the eye. All right. Yeah, one thing that I was hoping to get away with in this final segment of the grid was a situation where where I could have the F and the U touching diagonally, so that there's more deductions to be made about star placements. But I don't think the F and the U can touch diagonally in here and still without cutting anything off. But I can experiment with that. Okay, there is. If the U does something like this, which I'm not saying is a good idea, then the F can go in the bottom 3x3 area here. Oh, but we run into a problem where now the third row doesn't have all of the pieces it needs. So what if we, and now realizing that if we, yeah, I might have to go back and try a different placement of the N, not this vertical placement. So maybe it could go this way. don't have the immediate deduction of knowing that a certain square in the n can't have anything. Oh, but with this placement of the n, oh, we could place a star there. Okay, so we know that the leftmost column of the n has to have a star in it because there is only one star in that column. It could go in either one of those squares. We don't know yet. The rightmost column, therefore, can only hold one star, and it can't be in the bottom row of that column. So we still need one more star in that column, and that's got to come from the t down there, because we can't fit any of the remaining letters into the square that is diagonally adjacent to the n. We're back to needing an f and a u. And unless we put the u like this, which will again give us the problem of not knowing, of having more than one way to put stars in those particular rows, in the first two rows, then there's nowhere to put the f. Let's see, is there another way to put, could we put the f up top and the u lower? Maybe. If the f is going to go up top, it would have to do something like this. And the remaining part of the f could be in either direction. It could be like this, just let's say. And we now see that we need to have an L there, something here. Oh. There might be some other possible rotations of the f in this area, but the thing you have to be careful about with an f is that it's easy to cut off a small portion in the corner. Now there's a question about whether it has to go like that or like that. I don't think either of those can be distinguished unless it's a situation where it has to. Oh. So now I may have to say that I'll put a U somewhere just to be able to have the even though I have to distinguish the crossbar, I think I'm going to actually put a U in because it will have I'll know where the stars can go. And I'll just say, for the sake of things, that the U is like that. We know that one of the stars has to go there, and one of the stars has to go there. And now I'm worried about the N and the F, and I don't think that they can work in this configuration because of making the top two rows work without somehow cutting off U. So we go back again. Maybe I'll go back to the arrangement of the N that I had. One thing I just noticed about the possible placements of a U, uh, if uh, I think any way that will place both an F and a U into the remaining space without cutting off part of the grid, the U will have to be horizontal. That is more like a U than the letter C. So, well, obviously this arrangement isn't possible because it cuts off the top of the grid, but what that means is that there must be one, you must have, that U is going to have one uh, square in the rightmost column and one star in the leftmost column. And I think I can use that to determine some more things about where these can go. Oh, but I'm going to have yet another situation where I can't determine which of two possible orientations of the U is, unless. Nope. All right, so maybe it's not that position of the N. All right, I'm backing out of the N and trying, let's try a horizontal position. That doesn't seem terribly promising, except we know that it must go there. What I really want is to get something that forces part of the U to be adjacent to a star, which I guess, did I fully examine this? U, 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 U. It had to be U star and U star, and then I said that I couldn't fit anything in the first two rows, and I still agree with that. It's possible that I could change that V that's down here into something else, maybe exchange a V for an F, or a Z for an F. If we go, wait, you can't have a star in the I in the column you were checking earlier. Well, okay, so I see that Laplace has made some comments about logic for the I that I wasn't following up on, and unfortunately at this point I don't know what I had that made it that would have applied to it, so I'm gonna have to let that be. I think one thing that I might do here, though, oh, that's going to change the logic. I was going to say, if I change the L in the left-hand corner to an N, then the L would be easier to place elsewhere, but part of the logic that I had been doing was specific to the L in that it only had one square that wasn't in the leftmost column. So if we have that, then the N has to go here. Oops. So I might have to back up even further, which means doing a lot of backtracking. So the N didn't go there. That didn't go there. Wow, this is the nice thing about doing it in. What if I keep the y where I had it, but put something else in place of the t? The t was giving me specific sorts of logic. So we still know that we must have something there. Is there a way that I could put, say, for example, an f here? And the answer is yes. So I could put an f like that. And what does that do to the logic? I know I can have at most one in the bottom. Let's see. What do we have? I hope this isn't a case where I can swap around a couple of things, but no, it won't be a case where I can swap around a couple of things. I don't know where things go yet in this particular arrangement, but I think this is promising. We know we have a star in one of the two squares in there. All right. So now the remaining ones are T, U, and N, and I think that might be, excuse me, easier for me to work with. Because I can have, I think I can arrange things so that a T is adjacent to a U in a way that gives some useful deductions. So let me see if, and we still need to make room for an N. All right, let me see if I can arrange for that. So let's just, at this point, I'm now experimenting with placements. All right, we know that only one of the stars in the T can go on the bottom crossbar, so one of them must go up here. This particular arrangement is going to run into a problem where the stars in the T and the I can be swapped, but it might be a good way for me to start thinking. Is there anything else that I can do to move that T around and still have space for an N? Could have a T like that. Oh, but then we can't put anything in the seventh column. Well, can't go there. So I'm gonna go try this. All right, some deductions that I can, oh, that's blocking the W, that's blocking some white squares, so it's not like that. The other way that I wanted that to go doesn't work. There are some other ways to rotate the T, but I think they cause other problems, so the U isn't quite like that. Maybe we put the U over here. Now to get the T or the N, it's going to be adjacent. It would have to be like that. Don't think that an N will fit in the remaining space. No. Feel like I'm running out of options here. I'm going to take the L and reflect it, I think, because I'm running into some problems in the uppermost rows. And I think now we know that there must be an L in the uppermost row there, and that will, I think, give me more freedom to place these last few symbols. We still have to put the T, U, and N in, but we don't have as much constraint. We know that there's going to be a star in one of the third or fourth rows of the L, and we might be able to do some other things that allow us to make deductions based on that. I'm going to go back to what I was doing with the N. We know that the uppermost square in the N can't have a star, so the N has stars there and there. Alright. And now we have a T and a U to place. It's not quite possible to make the T and the U touch in the way that I want them to within this remaining space. So maybe instead of putting the N in that configuration, we put the N in this configuration, which I had tried before. Alright. Don't know much about that yet. Except that E's are going around here. Actually, let's try this. All right, we know at most one T can go in the right one star can go in the crossbar of the T. The other star must go there. And unless the N or U comes out from the top row, we can fix that. And that might not quite have done what I wanted it to. No, that's going to be problematic. Okay, so the other N must come from, the other star of the N must be in one of those two locations. I think I might have something that does what I want it to. Oh, but that doesn't give me a place to put the n. Bother. It might be, I don't see another good thing to switch out yet. Yeah, that's also gonna have a column that can't be fully filled. Oops. T, 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 T. Yes, this is... Oh. Nope, then we don't have room for the U again. I'm if you're still sticking with me through this gripping final stretch, well, thank you for your faith in what I'm doing. Maybe, yeah, let's try that. No, these are just not doing what I need them to. What if instead of using the W there, I put in... So again, switching shapes around, which is going to be difficult, possibly create an error. But I think we still have the same logic in not the W, now it's an N. Oops. If I put the N there, where the leftmost square of the N can't have a star because it is in a column that already must have 2 stars based on everything else. And that I can potentially use... now we have W, U, and T, so I can use that to narrow some other things down. And also, now the N is not connected to the border, which means I have fewer problems with cutting off whole sections of the grid, which is one thing that I was running into on my previous attempt. So, N-U-T, or sorry, W-U-T, if we have a W... All right. No, T can't go there. T can't go there. Can a W go in this area? Okay, yes, W will have to have a star there and a a star there. And then we can put a T here, and it's still not cutting off the rest of the grid. We can put one thing there. The other T. Oh, darn. Now I've hit a point where there are two possible places to put the second star in the T, and they can be swapped with the two possible places to put the second star in the Y. Actually, no, there might be a way. No. Okay, so maybe the W doesn't go there. Is there another place, another way to put the W in there that still works? No, because now the W is attached to the outside. What if it's like this? Okay, that actually works. If we put 3 T's in here, what does that do? We know we have something there. That's going to put a second star there. So there's going to be some interesting interaction. I don't know if there's a place to put a U that disambiguates everything the way that I would like it to, but I'm going to keep at it. All right, yeah, let's try putting a U here. I think this might actually do it. We've now put all of the shapes down. The U must have a star in each of the left and right columns, which means that there's now 2 stars guaranteed in the rightmost column. So we can place these. We don't know. Oh, yes, that's right. We could have 2 different ways of having the U arranged. So actually, that's not the 2 places to place the stars could be swapped. So what if I then instead try here for the U? We know that one of the stars in the U must be on the left and it can't touch the W. And now we have 2 stars in that particular row, so the other star in the U goes here. That is determined. That's a start. We might still have some lingering ambiguities. Let's see. So there's a star that is, we still haven't placed the second star in the V because we had backed out. So that goes in one of those columns. There's one in those. And there's one down there. I think we are now in a situation where there are going to be multiple solutions. That if we take a stab at any one of the possible placements for one of the stars in one of these shapes, that the others will follow. For example, if we were to go and put a star there in the V, we could then force some other star placements. And then, and already we see that there are two possible ways to finish off the T and the Y. So that is not a unique solution either. And there's no other way to position that W in there. So what if we put T in here, which is now legal because the N is not touching the edge. One of the squares in the T, one of the stars in the T must be in the bottom row, which puts 2 in there, which means we can actually fit that, the L there. The top one must be in the top. So now between the U and the W, one of them must go into the second row in order to finish, put a second star in that row. And it must also go into the fourth row to put a second star in there, unless it's the N. I don't think we can actually put a W in the upper corner because for it to cover both the second and fourth rows, it will cut off the upper corner of white space. So an N must go in the rightmost 2 rows, not necessarily the rightmost 2 rows, but it must go up in the upper right. And I think, yeah, it in fact must go, there's a couple of ways it can go. I don't see offhand whether one of them is better. Actually, does this... It might be that this cuts off... Yeah, there's no way to put a W in with that configuration. Oh, right. It's a U and a W. Huh. I was trying to fit an N in that I had already placed. All right, so a U and a W. The W doesn't fit up in that corner without cutting things off, so it must be a U, and it must go into the first and fourth. And that's also going to be a problem because we'll have it like... yeah, that's going to work like something like U, 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 and there's no place for the W. All right, so that T placement didn't work. Yeah, so yeah, in fact, there's no way to put both a U and a W in here. So that T placement didn't work. What else? I tried the W in the one way that I was pretty sure it would work. If I go back to using a U, So if I put a U here, we know that there must be a star there. The second star could be in either of the spaces on the right. Aha! If we put a T in like this, there must be a star on the top of the T. Oh, I've cut off the W again. You poor unfortunate T. All right, so the other thing that I was considering, something like this, but the T is going to be still going to be a problem. Where do we have to go? Oh no, that's not going to work with the L. All right. So yes, this is the sort of holding pattern at the end where you have to experiment with different placements till you find something that is fully consistent. You can do so in all refilled row. Yeah, if that's the other thing about a use, if you force it against a row that is fully filled, you can, or a column that is fully filled, you can make sure that both of these stars go in the other row or column. But right now we don't have any open rows that are uh, that are fully filled. All of the rows and columns that are filled are now completely filled with other things. Oh, I might actually have one more sort of desperation placement here. The n, since it's floating, I can now put something against it in the top row. And of the available options, I think the t is the best. That lets me go like this. And it puts something in the first two rows up here. I'm going to need something in... So I'm still going to need something in the... Oh, no, that's not going to work because I've now put myself in a position where I can't fill the column with a second star. The seventh column can't have a second star. So for the seventh column to have that second star, oh, that, no. Yep, I keep overlooking, well, everything. Can't remember what I placed last. Oh, I moved the n, but I don't know what happened before that. That might be going way too far back to really easily recover. But if I put the w up here, maybe that allows me to put... No, there's not a way to put the t in there. But, oh, if I change the f and the t now, going back to putting the t down here after having switched out the n. All right, what did I know about the placement of the t here? We can only have one thing in the bottom row. So that must be there, and the other one must be in the bottom row. Okay, so we need a v there. All right. And we now have u and t, and I believe I had... sorry, u and f, and now an f can fit like this, or I could reflect it, and that would still be okay. So maybe I'll reflect it to make it to make the logic stronger. All right. Oh, the second W star in the W must go there. Okay, this is a problem now because we have the spaces, the columns that must be filled by the U are too far apart, but that can be fixed by changing the orientation of the F. No, it doesn't have a star in it. And oh no. Yeah, that's still a problem. Well, maybe we put the F here. Forget about the W so far. Or put the F up there and put, if we put, no, we can't put the F up in that corner and have the W in that region as well. I don't think that will lead to a collision, yes. But if I went back to putting the F in here, I think it would have to be something like this. We know that there is a star there. We know that there's a star there. Okay, we know that there's, so the W can't go there. Can it go like, can I have a W that goes here? I can, but it would cut off space for the U. What if I make sure that the F is floating and not touching the X so that I can arrange other things near it without cutting off that portion of the grid? Okay, so a W then could potentially go something like this. That has to go there. Nope, that's a problem. All right, but okay. I think what the arrangement needs to do is force the the protruding segment of the Y to not be used, and use that to constrain a U, which is somewhere around here. But that won't work with the W placement. Oh, you fickle letters. Yep, that U placement isn't working. So if I do want the U to work, the way the F needs to be placed is something like this. No, I'm still going to run into trouble with the U. Oh, because of the L over there, but we don't know that extends there now. Oh. actually, if I were to now space the W, the two stars in the W must go there and there. And so the two stars in the F must go here and here. And now I've hit the point where the U is under-constrained. But I think I can actually get around that by making the W point differently. Still have the W here adjacent to the F. We will have something there. The only place something goes is there. That forces there to be something there. There is very technical, I know. Oh no, it's still under constrained. And that W can't touch the U. All right. No, that's not doing what I would need it to. Is there something else that I can trade for a W to make some of the logic work out? I think, yes, if I change the Z for a W, I think I can still use the same logic there. And in fact, run into some other things. Because we still know that the L has to have a star on the left column, which forces this W to put its two stars here and here. And a Z has can fit in some places that a W can't. So if I were to try to fit a Z in, one thing that I might do is something like a Z. Something like that, which that's not the best thing to put there, but I can still do something with a Z in this area. We know that this T down here doesn't necessarily have a thing. So we're going to, that's going to fill up the left-hand, the left-hand empty row is going to have a second star in it. And actually, yeah. Oh wait, what do we have? We have U and F remaining. I don't like that placement of the Z because it's still attached to the outside, but maybe I could do something. Yes, like that. Although that takes up a lot of space, so maybe the Z goes this way. But in order, this forces the U to go like this. And I don't think that's going to work. Um, we still have, what, the F. Maybe put the F back here, but so that would put a start there. Ah, yes. I can now put a U in this area here in the upper corner, because we now know that of the two possible places for the F second star, it can't go to the top one because then the U would not be able to have 2 stars without making 2 stars in either the first or second row. And so that can actually constrain these to be like that. So the things to watch out for are we're still missing a star in the in a couple of rows, but we haven't placed the second star in 2 of our shapes yet. That's fine. In fact, we can now say that in order to put 2 stars in this row, we must have something there. These must be empty. And so we have to have something here, and I think, oops, that's not the square that I thought I was in. So I think if I do this, I might be able to fill them all. Oh yes, because I can put that here, that here, that here, and that here. Why does it say I only have 4? I'm doing it again. I doubled a shape that I had already placed because I didn't count right. I want a Z. That's still... Can that be done? So the Z needs to be in the left. Maybe I go back and change the W, the Z, and exchange the Z and W again, back to the way it was before, because a W can get placed in like this, and we can have some stars. And in this placement, there is a, oh right, I forgot to add the stars back to the Z. And so now we do in fact have 1 star in every, or 2 stars in every row, column, and shape. Let me just double check that the empty space is connected. It looks like it is. That connected to that. Okay, yeah, the empty space is all connected. And so what this means, I would before I go on, I would definitely have to double check and make sure that this arrangement of shapes is uniquely solvable, because I have gone back and done some changes along the way that might have changed the logic in ways that I wasn't anticipating. But we now have a valid solution, and often when you get to the point where you have a valid solution, if you find that it's not unique, you might be able to tweak that solution to come up with something that is unique. So right now, I'm going to declare victory for now, and return to this I think in 2 weeks. I'm going to come back and show you how to assemble the second half of the puzzle, which is placing the statue part clues that people will see when they actually solve this. This is, as I said, the solution grid, and in some logic puzzles, you can write the clues as you go. I think in a statue battle, at least for me, I need to write the solution grid first, just like you would in a crossword puzzle. Well, not just like, because it's not words, but analogous to. So that is the completed solution grid, which I will check for uniqueness in a little while. I hope you'll join me in, as I said, 2 weeks from now when I add in the clues and turn this into hopefully a finished puzzle. I'm gonna, let's see, it's now 9 o'clock. I will be around. Are there any questions before I head off? Otherwise, I am just going to sign off. If you have further questions, I will try to check the comments and answer them in later on. So, as I said, I'll see you in 2 weeks. Thanks for tuning in. Bye, everyone.